Get ready for a spine-chilling experience. If you love feeling your heart race and the suspense creeping into the room, you're in the right place. But before we begin, I have an invitation for you. If you truly have the courage to face the unknown, go ahead and hit that like button now and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any terrifying stories. Share this video with someone who also loves the thrill of fear, but be careful. The scariest things tend to happen when you least expect it. Are you ready to face what's coming next? Let's see if you can handle it. Lucas had always been skeptical about the supernatural. At 23, he was at the beginning of his career and saw his internship at a downtown company as a golden opportunity. One night, while reviewing reports late at night, he overheard two colleagues talking about the elevator to hell. The story intrigued him, but he laughed, thinking it was all nonsense. A hidden floor? It seems like another legend invented to scare interns. He thought to himself. Intrigued, he decided to investigate what was behind the story. He found forums of people who claimed to have visited the secret floor and left traumatized, describing dark corridors and voices whispering their deepest fears. The more he read, the more intrigued he became. Is it really possible? He asked himself, feeling his curiosity transform into an intense desire to solve the mystery. It was almost midnight. Lucas decided he would take the test. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he loved a challenge. Anxiously, he entered the empty elevator, looked at the button panel, and prepared himself. It's just an ordinary elevator, he whispered to himself with a slight mocking smile. But when he pressed the sequence he had read on the forums, he felt an inexplicable shiver. As he pressed the last sequence of buttons, the elevator began to descend smoothly, but something felt wrong. Lucas noticed that the dashboard didn't display any numbers, just an opaque red light blinking. The feeling of familiarity I had with the building was quickly replaced by a growing uneasiness. He tried to control his panic, but the silence was deafening, almost as if the elevator was descending to a place time had forgotten. The descent seemed endless. When the elevator finally stopped, the doors slowly opened, revealing a dark hallway, with dim lights flickering in the distance. The air was thick, with a musty smell that made her skin crawl. Despite the tension, Lucas took a deep breath and took the first step out of the elevator. Come on, this is just a hallway, he muttered, trying to control the anxiety that was beginning to take over. Each step echoed on the dirty, cracked tile floor. The silence was absolute, as if the floor was isolated from the rest of the world. The darkness was thick, almost palpable, and the shadows on the walls seemed to move, twisting in a disturbing way. Lucas swallowed hard, but continued moving forward. He didn't know, but when he stepped on that floor, his life would never be the same. As Lucas walked down the hallway, something strange began to happen. The shadows on the walls seemed to take shape, and suddenly he saw images of himself. It was like watching a distorted movie of his life, but with details he would rather forget. The shadows showed painful moments from his childhood, his failures and most intimate fears. This isn't real, he repeated, trying to convince himself. In one of the visions, he saw the face of his father, who had passed away years ago. The figure murmured something incomprehensible, but the man's dark eyes seemed to pierce his soul. Lucas tried to look away, but it was impossible. The voices whispered dark words, recalling buried regrets and wrong choices. Each image seemed more alive, as if it were happening in that moment. Desperate to get away from the visions, Lucas began running down the hallway. But the further I went, the more the shadows became intense and realistic. He now heard screams, not just his own, but those of people he loved. Familiar voices called for help, echoing in his mind like an incessant nightmare. Lucas felt his sanity slipping through his fingers. This was no simple urban legend, it was something much worse. After what seemed like hours, Lucas stopped, panting, realizing that the hallway seemed to have no end. He turned back, but the elevator was gone. In its place, just more darkness and moving shadows. His rapid breathing betrayed his growing panic, and he knew he wasn't alone. "Is anyone there?" he shouted, but only the hollow echo responded. With each step, the hallway became narrower and more claustrophobic. The walls seemed to close in on him, and a feeling of despair enveloped him. His mind struggled to find a logical explanation, but it was impossible to ignore the horror around him. It was as if the place was alive, molding itself with each new step, defying any attempt to escape. Suddenly, Lucas saw a door at the end of the corridor. It was unlike anything I had seen before. An old wooden door with deep scratch marks and dried blood stains. He hesitated, but the feeling of being watched grew more intense. Something behind him murmured his name, and he knew he had no choice. As he opened the door, he felt like he was crossing into a new level of nightmare. Upon passing through the door, Lucas found himself in a huge room, almost like an abandoned hall. The walls were covered in broken mirrors, and he could see his distorted reflection in each of them. The images in the mirrors seemed to move on their own, each displaying a fragment of his life. In the corners, dense shadows gathered, watching him with invisible eyes. He heard a low, icy laugh coming from somewhere in the room. The sound seemed to get closer, but when he turned around, he saw no one. "You've come too far, Lucas," a voice whispered behind him. But when he turned around, there was again nothing. The shadows in the mirrors seemed to mock him, revealing distorted expressions that caused him uncontrollable nausea. Suddenly, the shadows began to draw closer, a figure standing out among them. It was a woman with pale skin and empty eyes, watching him with a sinister smile. "Did you want answers?" she asked, in a melancholy tone. Lucas tried to respond, but his voice broke. He knew he was in danger, but something was stopping him from leaving. That place had enchanted him. The woman stretched out her hand, and a strange piece of paper appeared before him. "To get out, you need to answer your own lies," she said, her voice echoing throughout the room. The paper contained loose sentences, questions about their fears and regrets. "What are the words you hid from the world?" she whispered, as the mirrors around her shook and cracked more. Lucas tried to respond, but with each poorly formulated response, a shadow approached, touching his cold skin against him. The feeling was of being consumed alive, and he realized that those shadows were fragments of his own mind, the parts he always tried to hide. I didn't hide anything," he lied, desperate to get away. The woman laughed softly, and the shadows began to speak at the same time, whispering every lie he had told himself. "You can't leave," they said in unison. He felt his head spin, and a deep nausea overcame him. Lucas knew that to escape he would need to confront the darkest parts of his soul. Lucas fell to his knees, feeling the shadows intertwine around his body like serpents, whispering forgotten secrets and promises. Each touch of them seemed to steal a piece of energy from him, leaving him weaker and more lost. He felt as if he were being absorbed into the building itself, a part of the legend he had so mocked. In an act of desperation, he shouted that he was sorry, but the shadows laughed, mocking his request for forgiveness. "You never believed," they murmured, "and now you are part of us." Lucas tried to walk away, but the room continued to expand, revealing new corridors and doors that seemed to lead nowhere. Desperate, he ran, but every door he opened took him back to the Hall of Mirrors. Each mirror displayed his face, aged, with empty eyes and pale skin. The shadows chased him, and he felt time slipping away. He finally understood. The hidden floor was not just a place. It was a trap created by fear itself. After hours of escape, Lucas found a small door in the corner of the room. This time, it looked different, with a soft light escaping through its cracks. He knew it could be a trap, but he had no choice. When he opened the door, he saw a staircase going up, spiraling to an invisible point. Determined, he began to climb, each step a torture, each step heavier than the last. As he went up, the light became more intense, until he found a small, empty room with a window showing the lower floor. When he looked down, he saw himself trapped in the Hall of Shadows, his reflection now part of those creatures that haunted him so much. "You never left," whispered the familiar voice, echoing through the room. Reality distorted, and Lucas realized that what he thought was a way out was just a new level of imprisonment. Now he was part of the cycle, a formless shadow, doomed to torment those who, like him, defied the elevator. The building fed on fear, eternally imprisoning the souls of the curious. The next morning, the elevator was found on the ground floor, empty and harmless. The building's employees, accustomed to the legends, avoided using it, and few knew the fate of those who dared to try the sequence after midnight. Only cameras recorded moments of doors opening and closing without anyone there, as if the elevator had a life of its own. Lucas was never seen again, but rumors about the hidden floor spread. Those who dared to challenge the elevator reported visions of a man, with a lost look and a pale body, wandering through the dark corridors. He mumbled disjointed phrases, as if trying to warn others, but to no avail. In one last shot, a disturbing image emerged. Lucas, or what was left of him, looking directly at the camera, with empty eyes and a pained expression. The elevator to hell would continue its hunt, awaiting the next onlookers. With Lucas' disappearance, the building became a place of mystery and fear. Employees avoided staying after hours, and a feeling of discomfort came over anyone who passed near the elevator. New rumors emerged. Some people said they heard whispers and saw shadows of a pale man, with empty eyes, standing in the corner of the elevator. "It's as if he was waiting," they commented. At the end of the day, a young woman named Carla decided to challenge the elevator. She was a new intern and had heard the stories about Lucas. Curious, she entered the elevator and pressed the sequence of buttons. As the elevator began to descend, the light inside the cabin began to flicker, and the atmosphere around it became suffocating, almost alive. The feeling was that something was about to happen. When the elevator stopped, Carla found herself in a long, dark hallway. The same feeling of claustrophobia that Lucas had felt now enveloped her. She heard light footsteps behind her and, when she turned, she saw the shadow of a man. It was Lucas. His ghostly figure watched her from afar, his eyes filled with despair and warning. But she was not alone. Shadows were also lurking. Carla tried to run, but the corridor seemed to go on indefinitely. The shadows approached, like a dark tide ready to swallow her. Suddenly, Lucas appeared at his side, whispering, "You need to leave, before it's too late." His voice was muffled, almost a memory of what had been, and his gaze conveyed a fear that left her unable to react. He extended his hand to her, and Carla, hesitantly, took it. But upon touching his skin, an icy sensation invaded his body. The vision around her distorted, as if she was being dragged through another dimension. Visions of terrible memories appeared around him, showing moments of pain and despair from unknown people, perhaps other victims of the elevator. When Carla let go of Lucas's hand, he disappeared, leaving her alone in the dark corridor. The shadows around her grew, and she heard whispers in different voices, all asking for help, all doomed to the same fate. She knew she needed to find a way out, but the darkness seemed to close in around her, preventing her from returning. Desperate, Carla wandered through the dark corridor, which now seemed like an infinite maze. Each door he opened led to a new shadowy section, with corridors that twisted and bent at impossible angles. The feeling of being trapped in a nightmare was overwhelming. She felt presences around her, figures of people who had been consumed by darkness. As she explored the maze, she began to recognize the shadows. They were distorted, familiar faces, missing coworkers, other people who had entered the elevator and never returned. "We're trapped," one of the shadows whispered. "This place consumes us. It is our own fear." The words echoed, accompanied by a macabre laugh, as if the building itself was mocking everyone. At the end of a corridor, he found an old and dirty mirror. As he got closer, he saw his reflection, but it seemed to be twitching, changing shape. The face he saw was not his own, but Lucas's, with empty eyes and a warning look. "Get out while you still can," he murmured through the glass, but she felt the exit getting further and further away. With fear growing, Carla continued through the maze, trying to ignore the voices that called her name, seeming to echo from the deepest corners. As he turned a corner, he saw a female figure, with long hair and empty eyes, like Lucas. It was another elevator victim, perhaps one of the first. The woman watched her with a sad, distorted smile. "You're not leaving here," the figure whispered, as he reached out his hand to Carla. Panicking, she tried to move away, but the woman began to follow her, her footsteps echoing through the darkness. The faster Carla tried to escape, the closer the woman seemed to get, her presence increasingly oppressive and cold. Eventually, Carla found a door marked with an eye symbol, as if she was being watched. When he opened it, he found himself in a small windowless room, where the walls were covered with nail marks, as if someone had tried to escape, leaving traces of struggle and despair. In the corner, she saw a kneeling figure, and as she approached, she realized it was herself, reflected in a shadowy mirror. Carla began to hear a rhythmic sound, like a heartbeat, resounding from all directions. She followed the sound, feeling mesmerized, as if drawn by an invisible force. The maze seemed to transform as it progressed, the walls moving, as if the building itself had life. The shadows began to sing softly, forming a chorus of high, sad voices. Upon reaching the center of the maze, he found a large room, where an empty chair was illuminated by a dim light. The feeling that something was watching her every move was overwhelming. Carla felt an invisible hand push her into the chair, and before she could react, she was sitting, unable to move. The heart of the labyrinth had captured her. Shadows gathered around her, whispering indecipherable words, and the feeling of despair was unbearable. Lucas appeared once more, his eyes reflecting emptiness and torment. "He watches us," he said, with a warning tone. Carla realized that the him Lucas was referring to was the building itself, a living entity that fed on fear. With her mind already on the verge of sanity, Carla began to understand that the hidden floor was not just a place. It was a trap created by the fear and suffering of the victims who entered the elevator. Every shadow, every whisper, was a soul that the building had trapped, and now she was part of that cycle. Upon realizing this, the presence around her intensified, as if it was ready to consume her. Lucas's figure approached her, his empty eyes watching her silently. "You have a choice," he murmured. "Surrender to fear or face it." Carla, fighting despair, tried to get up from the chair, but the shadows held her arms and legs, like invisible chains. The building required a sacrifice to free her. With all the strength she had left, Carla began to scream, facing the shadows that held her. She screamed to be heard, refusing to give in. The shadows hesitated, their whispers fading, and the room began to dissipate. She felt like she was succeeding, but the effort was almost unbearable. The building, however, was not willing to let her go so easily. With one last effort, Carla managed to free herself from the shadows and ran down the corridor. Now, instead of doors that led to new nightmares, she saw the elevator in front of her, with the doors open, waiting for her. Hope was reborn in her heart, and she entered the elevator, eager to return to the real world. He pressed the button for the ground floor, and the elevator began to rise slowly. As the elevator went up, Carla felt the tension ease. Finally, she was free from the hidden floor. But when she looked at the control panel, she realized that the numbers were wrong, repeating the sequence of buttons that had sent her to hell. A soft laugh echoed through the elevator, and she felt the despair return. When the elevator doors opened, Carla couldn't find the ground floor. "I was back in the dark corridor, and the figure of Lucas was waiting, with a sad and resigned smile. "No one ever leaves," he said, as the surrounding shadows closed in around her. She had understood too late that the hidden floor was an endless prison, and now she was part of it forever. The elevator to hell continued to capture those who dared to challenge the unknown. And the building, a living entity, waited patiently for the next curious person who was willing to risk everything and lose their sanity.